All right, Griffin, chapter 6, the metaphysics of human rights, and we're now in chapter 6, yes, and in 6.4, same heading as the chapter. We are at the metaphysics of human rights. Well, all of this so far has been leading up to a discussion of the metaphysics of human rights because we haven't talked about those yet, right? All Griffin has talked about so far is values and human interests, right? He hasn't talked about rights. So what he now introduces is sort of a way to kind of think about the discussion so far and where the step he wants to go to now, which is from what he's talked about so far with values to human rights. Because remember, human rights are built on certain kinds of values, and we're going to see what his chief values are, namely autonomy, liberty, and welfare, right? And human rights are firmly anchored in those because those values are part and parcel of, guess, our normative capabilities, right? So all this stuff is kind of sloshing around, but you got to kind of keep it all straight that the main thing is human rights protect normativity, and what's part of normativity? Well, the ability to conceptualize, et cetera, and act upon. So right now we're just trying to get a little bit past what he's going to call prudence to the domain of morality, or the subdomain of morality, which is human rights. Because remember, Griffin does not want us to identify the domain of morality with human rights. In other words, he doesn't want everything in ethics to just be a case of human rights. In other words, ethics is just the study of human rights. He doesn't like that at all, right? And so we'll see this come up more in part 2 of the book, because remember, we're still in part 1 where he's kind of laying out his theory. When he talks more about liberty and welfare and autonomy, we'll see more instances of how he tries to say, no, human rights are important, but they're just a sub domain of morality, which is bigger. Okay, so we've seen that human interests have the biological, non-biological, and that the non-biological ones can be kind of trivial in some cases. They're just a matter of attitude. But there are much deeper ones, like, again, our old friend, the sense of fulfillment, like fulfillment in life. And so we can talk about human interests and their fulfillment they can have some objectivity, well, at least a sense of it, not perfect, no God's eye view stuff, maybe no 2 + 2 = 4 stuff, but something similar to the objectivity that we find in theories in science, right? Not identical, not, again, we're doing ethics here, we're not doing math. So we have to accept the levels of objectivity that really the discipline allows us, as Aristotle says, to have. You can't expect that level of objectivity that you find in number theory and arithmetic here in ethics. But it doesn't mean that we don't find any objectivity. So if it's the case that we've talked about human interests, non-bio-human interests, as having an objective sense of being fulfilled or not, he's going to call the level of kind of prudence. Well, how much of this objectivity can carry over to the human rights derived? Now, be careful about the term derived, because we're not doing like a logical derivation, but that's connected to. So from this notion of fulfilling human interests. So going from P to M, right? Like how much objectivity can carry over? So when we're talking about human rights, how objective can these really be? Can they borrow some of that objectivity via that we've seemed to have established for the fulfillment or human interests, right? The non-bio-human interests, right? He says in some cases, going from prudence to morality, it's not so bad because it's fairly direct. So in this one, to go from something like a statement like that's cruel to don't be cruel, which is more of a moral statement, like some kind of obligation, right? Some kind of imperative, like don't be cruel. That's a fairly basic norm, and he thinks that one pretty well inherits. That's cruel is, yes, it's a judgment about action, right? So you are saying that it is a judgment about a particular action. It's a fairly smooth transition. It keeps when we go from that judgment about an action, like that's cruel, to an imperative, don't be cruel, he thinks that's a fairly easy transition. It it has a condemnatory force already here. So this sort of imperative that's here is transferred over as well. Cruelty is closely linked. Like cruelty is closely linked to something that we often regard as pretty well obvious, that pain is not a good thing. And sometimes we do argue, whoa, pain can be okay. How? Well, you go to the dentist and they say, well, this is going to hurt, but it's only going to hurt for a little while. I'll try my best to alleviate the pain, and you'll be better off in the long run. Like, we'll get rid of that tooth that's causing you grief or something, because if I don't get rid of it now, it'll be bad. But you're still saying that pain is a bad thing, because you wouldn't say something like, hey, if pain's not really an intrinsically bad thing, then don't give me any painkillers. Like, just yank that tooth out, and we'll pretend it's the 19th century dentistry or something. We don't do that, right? So you got to be careful when people say, well, pain isn't intrinsically wrong. Because why is it that no matter what, we try to eliminate it, even in dentistry, right? Think about how many, painless dentistry, nobody would advocate, put their shingle out saying painful dentistry, but, the pain is not necessarily bad. No, pain is something that's, you can pretty well argue is a bad thing. You gotta do a lot of kind of dancing, argumentative dancing to get around the sort of the negative connotations of pain, because we always try to get rid of it, right? So even when it's part and parcel of something that's good, like in medicine, there's a pain that's part of the healing process. We still do all kinds of things, doctors will say, don't tough it out. You should actually take a painkiller, because you're going to waste too much energy toughing it out, energy that you could put into healing if you take the painkiller. So even it's pretty hard to get that argument off the ground that pain is not really bad, right? You got to do a little bit of dancing. So because that's cruel is like you're inflicting pain, right? And even worse than the infliction of pain for good purposes, and we try to get rid of that pain. Is it needless infliction of pain? Cruelty is like super bad, right? So it's like a double bad kind of situation, and so this seems to be clear as a true norm. Like, don't do that, right? It's so closely connected to something that's kind of physical and a human interest that it seems to inherit it. So the general grammar of pain is that it's bad, right? It's something to be avoided. So that's a fairly simple, basic norm that moving from kind of a prudential sort of thing over here about a fulfillment or a non-fulfillment to a norm, pretty easy. More complicated is when you start adding in positive duties, because here we're just saying don't be cruel, which is essentially a negative, like, don't do that, right? But when we're saying for stuff to do, right, we've seen this. This will come up over and over and over again, right? The notion of what should you be doing, what are the limits of how much you're being asked to do when the notion of positive duties comes around, because this is way more complex. There's consequences of our positive actions. Sometimes when you do something and it's like a small thing you did, but it has a huge positive thing, well, that's easy to judge. But what about ones where they have just small differences between doing and not doing? We have a harder time with those. And, big demands, small payoff, that's harder, because we've also got empirical conditions to consider and human capacities, right? I may have a human capacity to do something that's really dangerous to me if I know I'm going to save a life. But do I have the capacity to do something really dangerous to me if it's only going to help brighten someone's day? Stuff like that. So, that's a bit of a trivial example, but I think you can get the point of here, once we add in positive duties, it becomes much more complicated. And Griffin says that since this complication includes empirical conditions, human capacities, it's got kind of a policy dimension to it, right? So it's it's a more complex process here. So it's harder to say how much objectivity here. Clearly, it's not going to be an easy inheritance to move from prudence here to something that has a policy dimension. All right. So, but still, as he says, what I talked about earlier, the vagueness part of the consequences. That doesn't stop us. We still go ahead and do these kinds of things, but it does make things much more complicated. Um, but nonetheless, we do over time become more sensitive to these issues and increase our respect for certain values, like the value of human life. But in any case, rights and policy, they become linked as things get more complicated. Um, but it's a kind of, as he says, like if you think about it, it usually is a kind of organic sort of mixture that these rights, they grow up in certain societies. And in that sense, yeah, they can be tied to certain cultures or whatever. That doesn't mean they're inextricably linked to those and they can't become universalized as well. But we'll see more about that a little bit later. But also, he doesn't think that, assessing policies is always going to be as simple as right or wrong. It's usually going to be gradations of better or worse. And even then, that's not always going to be clear because certain policies might be very good for a certain community at a certain time, maybe not at another, or two communities that are separate from some distance and maybe they're close culturally, but not perfectly close. One policy could work for one and not for the other. But and also in terms of the deep policies, it's very difficult to tell which one is better than the other. So there is necessarily an empirical side to all this, and there's no way to have a complete and easy algorithm to judge which one's better or worse. But we don't really think of it as true or false. We're still stuck with this kind of ambiguity or vagueness about better or worse, but we don't let that stop us.